find the freedom of these hills, and I'm glad I did it. Oh, well, I wonder how Charlie was feeling. That was really his introduction to walking in Scotland. He'd ridden a horse to Kinloch-Arkaig, then he started on foot through Glen Pean, through the bogs, and then through the rocks. And I think I know how he must have felt when he got here. Coming through the boulders, you've got to dodge obstacles, climbing up through fallen rocks, then up onto grassy spurs, and always the ridge is still ahead of you. And then at the very notch in the pass, he would start going downhill for the first time, because he had to come down to the edge of Loch Morar, and then there's a very savage bit of country, all peat hags and wee lochans, to get to Meable. And he spent the night, it said, in a shield hut there, absolutely exhausted, the most tired he'd ever been in his life. And then it was a question of up the next day and crossing the spur again to get down to the shores of Loch na Ua, where he had first landed in Scotland. And from the foot of Glen Beesdale he came to Borrowdale House, a key point. He spent the night there, but it was the last time he was to stay there because the house was destroyed. And when he came back again to carry on the flight, this is where he had to make do with what was here. And it's not very much, but what a hideout. I could hardly find it when I came. I had to look hard on the rocks. I saw the faint traces of a path, climbed up through the hole, dropped into this cavern, and you could shelter at least 10 men. Lord Lovat had reminded bonnie Prince Charlie at Gorthlec that his great ancestor Robert the Bruce had failed 11 times before he won independence for Scotland. And that cave was full of spiders. Strange. But I think you couldn't pick a better cave, because from the mouth of it you get that marvellous view right over Loch na Ua. But Charlie had a good reason for wanting away in a hurry, I think. It was, I feel, essential for him to save his face. Things had gone so far wrong with him, and I think he felt if he got away, he might come back. Whereas if he stayed, all might have been lost. I know this much, he must have regretted that particular night of departure, because it was a stormy night. They had an 8-oared open boat, and before the Prince was round into Arisaig Bay, he was dying to get back ashore, but it was too late by that time. They were on their way to cast up where they could. It happened to be in Becula. And it was from a cave in Borrowdale the Prince came here on the 18th of July, back to the mainland again after 2 months in the Hebrides, where he didn't get a ship for France. And this is what he saw when he came here. He was looking down on the head of Glen Shiel at Glenfinnan, where 11 months earlier the clans had rallied to march on London. But this time there was something very ominous. Everywhere were redcoats searching for him, and they knew he was here. He'd been spotted, they'd been trying to trace his movements, and he'd only one way of escape, and that was through the high peaks of Knoydart. And as the redcoats drew nearer, they knew they would have to move up to 3,000 feet above Glen Pean. And it was there they found the man who had taken them through Knoydart, none other than Donald Cameron of Glen Pean. And he had been watching the redcoats in Glen Pean, and he knew if they lay up long enough, they could slip through, cross into the next glen, Glen Desiree, climb over a high ridge down to Loch Cuich, another ridge, and they were at Loch Hourn. And the navy who'd been blockading all the way from Loch Hourn to Glen Nevis, and the soldiers who were all the way to the east, were outwitted by the skill of the few Highlandmen who were passing the Prince on from glen to glen. And the examples of loyalty that came to the Prince, you know, that was one of the great things of this campaign. It showed the kind of men that the Highlanders were. There was one, for example, MacIan, who befriended the Prince, and he was hanged for stealing a cow, which he needed for survival, and yet he could have shot the Prince and got a reward of £30,000. When I first came to the Highlands in the 1930s, finding the glens, I hardly saw anybody. I used to take my holidays in May. Time I loved, everything was just at its peak. And when you came through the glens, everybody was pleased to see you, especially in the remote houses. In fact, it was hard to camp because you were always being invited into houses. If you were away in the hill, with a wee plate of scones or something when you came back, a jug of milk or a few eggs. And by the time I was about 19 or 20, practically every friend I had lived in a wild part of the Highlands. And the Highlands became really a part of my life, although I lived in Glasgow. Well, time passed after the war. Suddenly everybody started to get richer. Motor cars became common currency amongst the ordinary working folk. Everybody discovered the Highlands. And today, more and more people want to live in the Highlands. Every summer, the roads are jammed. And nowadays, I find that I use my knowledge of the Highlands to find the Highlands as I used to know them. And these secret places, like the rough bounds of Knoydart, which will always appeal to me, have a melancholy about them. The ghosts of history walk there. In some ways, the ghosts of my own history too, because most of the friends that I made in these early days are dead. And they were the ones, in some ways, who put this country in real perspective for me. So I am away for a few more days into the rough bounds of Knoydart.